People like you don't belong in penthouses. The words sliced through the marble lobby of the Platinum Royal Hotel like a blade through silk, sharp enough to make every guest within earshot freeze mid-step. But what happened next would transform not just one hotel, but an entire industry, proving that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most devastating power. The autumn rain painted Seattle's skyline in shades of gray as Daniela Chen stepped out of the taxi onto the polished sidewalk of the Platinum Royal Hotel. No designer handbag, no chauffeur, no entourage of assistants trailing behind her with phones pressed to their ears. Just a woman in a simple navy dress, her black hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, carrying herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from owning everything in sight without needing to announce it. The doorman barely glanced up as she approached, his attention focused instead on a wealthy-looking couple emerging from a Mercedes behind her. It was exactly what she'd expected, exactly what she'd come to witness firsthand. For 3 years, Daniela had been receiving complaints about the Platinum Royal whispers of discrimination that somehow never made it into official reports, guest experiences that left people feeling smaller than when they'd arrived. Today, she would see for herself what kind of culture her company had allowed to flourish in this gleaming tower of marble and gold. The lobby stretched before her like a cathedral of wealth, its soaring ceilings catching the light from crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's homes. The air carried the subtle scent of expensive flowers and furniture polish, that particular perfume of privilege that whispered to everyone who entered that they were somewhere special, somewhere exclusive. Daniela moved across the marble floor with measured steps, her reflection dancing alongside her in the polished stone, a reminder of all the times she'd been told she didn't belong in spaces like this. The memory hit her suddenly vivid as a photograph. She was 17 again, standing in the lobby of the Meridian Grand in Atlanta, her acceptance letter to Harvard clutched in one hand, her small suitcase in the other. She'd saved for months to afford one night in that hotel, wanting to celebrate her full scholarship before starting college. The desk clerk had looked at her state school clothes, her nervous excitement, her obvious attempt to stretch beyond her means, and found her wanting. "I'm sorry, but this section is reserved for our premium guests only," he'd said, even though she had a confirmed reservation. She'd slept in her car that night, the acceptance letter still in her pocket, promising herself that someday she'd build something better. That someday had become Grandview Hospitality Group, 289 hotels, spanning 6 continents, employing 47,000 people, generating $2.8 billion annually. But numbers on a financial statement meant nothing if the culture was rotten, if her own employees were treating guests the way she'd been treated all those years ago. This was why she made these unannounced visits, why she dressed down and observed how her properties truly operated when they thought no one important was watching. Near the front desk, a young woman with kind eyes and nervous energy was arranging guest information packets with the careful attention of someone still new enough to take pride in getting every detail right. Sofia Martinez, according to the name tag pinned to her crisp uniform, looked up as Daniela approached, offering a genuine smile that felt different from the practiced courtesy Daniela had observed from other staff members. There was warmth there, humanity, the kind of authentic welcome that Grandview was supposed to represent. Behind Sofia, a man in his mid-40s moved with the territorial confidence of someone who'd claimed this space as his kingdom. Richard Crawford, the general manager, had worked for Grandview for 12 years, climbing steadily through the ranks with efficiency reports that praised his attention to detail and fiscal responsibility. What those reports didn't capture, what Daniela was beginning to understand, was how that efficiency might look different depending on who was on the receiving end. Crawford's eyes settled on her with the calculating assessment of someone trained to categorize guests by their perceived value. His gaze taking in her simple dress, her lack of obvious wealth markers, her calm but unremarkable presence. She could see the decision forming behind his eyes even before he moved the subtle shift from professional courtesy to cool evaluation that would determine how the next few minutes would unfold. This was the moment that mattered, the test that would reveal whether Grandview Hospitality truly lived up to its name, or whether it had become just another beautiful facade hiding the same old patterns of exclusion and judgment. Daniela straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of every person who'd ever been made to feel small in places like this, and walked toward the desk where her own employee was about to show her exactly what kind of company she'd built. "Good afternoon," Daniela said, as she approached the reception desk, her voice carrying the warmth and professionalism she'd trained thousands of employees to embody. "I have a reservation under Chen for the penthouse suite." Sophia looked up from her computer screen with that same genuine smile, her fingers already moving toward the keyboard to pull up the booking information. But before she could type a single letter, Crawford stepped forward, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic at the desk. There was something in his posture that suggested he'd been watching Daniela since she walked in, something in his expression that said he'd already made up his mind about what kind of guest she was likely to be. "Are you certain about the location?" Crawford asked, his tone carrying just enough politeness to avoid being overtly rude, but with an undercurrent that suggested genuine doubt. "The penthouse suite is quite exclusive, and I want to make sure there hasn't been some sort of mix-up with your reservation." The words hung in the air like smoke, seemingly innocent, but carrying implications that everyone within earshot could feel. Sophia's smile faltered slightly as she glanced between her manager and the guest, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interaction was taking, but unsure how to navigate the sudden tension that had materialized around what should have been a routine check-in. Daniela's expression remained perfectly calm, but something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition of a pattern she'd hoped she wouldn't find here. "I'm quite certain," she replied evenly. "Chen Penthouse Suite confirmed 3 days ago through your corporate reservation system." Crawford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he turned toward Sophia with the kind of look that clearly communicated his expectations. "Go ahead and check the system," he said, but his tone suggested he already knew what she would find or what he expected her to find. "I'm sure we can clear up any confusion." Sophia's hands moved reluctantly to her keyboard, her discomfort becoming more obvious with each passing second. The computer screen reflected in her eyes as she pulled up the reservation system, and Daniela watched as those same eyes widened with surprise. There it was, clear as daylight on the monitor, Chen Daniela Penthouse Suite Executive Override status, paid in full with corporate authentication codes that only came from the highest levels of the company hierarchy. But when Sophia opened her mouth to confirm the reservation, she caught sight of Crawford's expression, and the words died in her throat. He was staring at her with the kind of intensity that spoke of performance reviews and employment security, the kind of look that reminded her she was still in her probationary period, still vulnerable to the whims of management. Her eyes dropped back to the screen, then to her hands, then anywhere except toward the woman standing patiently at the desk. "I'm showing some irregularities in the booking," Sophia said quietly, the lie sitting uncomfortably on her tongue as she avoided Daniela's gaze. "It might be best if we verify a few additional details before proceeding." The betrayal was quiet but complete, the moment when institutional pressure overrode personal integrity, when fear of professional consequences silenced the voice of truth. Around them, other guests had begun to notice the unusual delay at the front desk, the way the conversation seemed to have taken on a weight that normal check-ins didn't carry. Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired civil rights attorney who'd been staying at the hotel for the past week while visiting her daughter, lowered her newspaper and watched the scene unfold with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent 40 years recognizing discrimination in all its forms. There was something about the way the manager was positioning himself, the way his questions seemed designed more to intimidate than to clarify, that activated every legal instinct she'd developed over decades of fighting battles just like this one. Near the elevators, Maya Patel adjusted her phone casually. the travel blogger's instincts telling her that whatever was happening at the front desk was worth documenting. Her social media following had grown to nearly 100,000 people specifically because she had a talent for capturing moments when travel went wrong, when the hospitality industry revealed its less hospitable side. Something about this interaction felt different, though more significant than the usual service failures and overbooking drama that filled her content calendar. Crawford seemed to sense the growing attention from around the lobby, and his voice took on a slightly louder quality, as if he wanted to make sure his authority was clearly established for anyone who might be watching. "I'm going to need to see additional identification," he said to Daniela, "and we'll need to verify the payment method used for this booking. As I'm sure you can understand, the penthouse suite requires special clearance, and we've had issues in the past with fraudulent reservations." The word fraudulent hit the air like a small explosion carrying implications that went far beyond simple verification procedures. Dr. Williams folded her newspaper entirely, now her legal mind cataloging the language being used, the assumptions being made, the pattern of behavior that was becoming impossible to ignore. Maya's phone was recording openly. Now her followers always hungry for content that revealed the ugly side of luxury travel. Jessica Torres, the senior receptionist working beside Sophia, tittered nervously as she watched the exchange, her own discomfort manifesting as inappropriate amusement. "Ma'am," she said with exaggerated politeness, "maybe there's been some confusion about which property you intended to book. We have several sister hotels in the area that might be more suitable for your needs." The suggestion hung in the air like an accusation, the implication clear to everyone present that Daniela might be better served at some other presumably less exclusive establishment. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, the way discrimination dressed itself up in helpful concern, the way bias masqueraded as professional guidance. Daniela absorbed it all with the same calm composure she'd maintained since walking through the doors. But something was shifting behind her steady gaze. Some internal calculation being made about how far she would allow this charade to continue before revealing exactly who she was and what kind of power she actually wielded in this marble cathedral of hospitality. The tension in the Platinum Royal's lobby had thickened to the point where even casual observers could feel it pressing against their skin like humidity before a storm. Richard Crawford stood behind the reception desk with the confidence of a man who'd never been meaningfully challenged in his own domain, his 12 years of managing this property having given him a sense of ownership that extended far beyond his actual authority. What Crawford didn't realize, couldn't have known as he orchestrated this performance of professional discrimination, was that his entire understanding of power was about to be revealed as an illusion built on the shakiest of foundations. He'd grown up in a small Tennessee town where people looked like him, sounded like him, and shared his assumptions about who belonged where and why. College had been a state school where those assumptions went largely unchallenged, and his career in hospitality had been spent climbing ladders in environments where his biases were either ignored or quietly reinforced by systems designed to keep certain types of guests comfortable at the expense of others. The pattern had been so consistent for so long that Crawford had begun to mistake his prejudices for professional instincts, his discrimination for discernment. When he looked at Daniela Chen standing calmly at his reception desk, he saw what he'd been trained to see by years of uncorrected assumptions, someone who didn't fit the profile of a penthouse guest, someone whose presence in this exclusive space represented a threat to the order he'd worked so hard to maintain. "I'm going to have to insist on additional verification," Crawford said, his voice carrying that particular tone that service industry professionals used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. "Given the high value of the accommodation you're claiming to have reserved, I'm sure you'll understand that we need to be absolutely certain about the legitimacy of the booking." Sophia Martinez felt each word like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, the moral compromise she'd already made becoming heavier with every passing moment. Her computer screen still displayed Daniela's reservation information with crystal clarity, executive override status, corporate authentication codes, payment confirmed through the highest levels of Grandview's internal system. But Crawford's expectation was clear. His authority absolute within the small world of this hotel lobby, and Sophia's position was too precarious to risk by contradicting his obvious intent. The young woman's internal struggle was visible to anyone paying close attention, the way her eyes kept darting between her screen and her manager's face, the way her fingers hovered over the keyboard without typing, the way she seemed to shrink into herself as she grappled with a choice that would define not just this moment, but her understanding of who she was and what she stood for. Dr. Williams had moved closer to the front desk, her retired attorney's instincts fully activated by what she was witnessing. 40 years of civil rights law had given her an expert eye for recognizing discrimination in action, and everything about this interaction triggered alarms that she couldn't ignore. The language being used, the assumptions being made, the power dynamics being enforced, it all added up to a textbook case of the kind of bias that she'd spent her career fighting. "Excuse me," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms and boardrooms. "But I couldn't help noticing that this guest seems to be facing unusual scrutiny for what should be a routine check-in procedure." Crawford turned toward her with the barely concealed irritation of someone unaccustomed to being questioned by anyone, let alone by another guest who had no direct stake in the matter at hand. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a standard verification process for our premium accommodations," he said, his tone suggesting that the discussion was closed and her input was neither welcome nor necessary. But Dr. Williams had heard that particular deflection countless times before. The way discrimination always disguised itself as policy, the way bias always claimed to be procedure, standard for whom she asked her legal training evident in the precision of her question. "I've been staying here for a week and witnessed several penthouse check-ins that proceeded without any of this additional verification you're describing." The observation landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread through the small crowd of witnesses that had begun to gather around the reception desk. Maya Patel's phone was capturing every word now, her social media instincts telling her that this was the kind of content that could explode across platforms, the kind of real-time documentation of discrimination that audiences craved. Crawford's face flushed slightly as he realized that his actions were being scrutinized by someone with the legal expertise to understand exactly what she was witnessing. "Every guest's situation is unique." He said the words coming out slightly faster than he intended, "and we reserve the right to verify any booking that raises questions about authenticity." What questions? Daniela spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice still perfectly calm but carrying a new quality that seemed to command attention from everyone within earshot. "What specifically about my reservation raises questions that wouldn't apply to any other guest seeking to check into accommodations they've legitimately booked and paid for?" The question hung in the air with surgical precision, cutting through Crawford's carefully constructed justifications and exposing the emptiness at their core. He'd been so focused on maintaining his authority and control that he'd failed to prepare actual reasons for his behavior, failed to construct a logical defense for actions that were driven by bias rather than business necessity. "It's not personal." Crawford said the words tumbling out as he struggled to regain his footing in a conversation that was slipping away from his control. "We've had issues with fraudulent bookings, and certain demographics tend to be associated with those problems." The words hit the marble lobby like a physical blow so openly discriminatory that even Crawford seemed to realize he'd crossed a line as soon as they left his mouth. Sophia gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth in shock at her manager's blatant admission of racial profiling. Dr. Williams pulled out her own phone, her legal instincts demanding documentation of what she'd just heard. Maya's live stream exploded with comments as viewers recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would likely have consequences far beyond this single interaction. The number of people watching climbed rapidly as word spread across social media platforms that something significant was happening at the Platinum Royal Hotel in Seattle. Daniela absorbed the admission with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter, but something had shifted in her posture. Some internal decision made about how much longer she would allow this performance to continue before revealing the truth that would transform everything. The marble lobby of the Platinum Royal had become a stage where justice and prejudice circled each other like predators, each waiting for the moment to strike. Richard Crawford stood behind his reception desk like a king defending a throne that was never truly his, unaware that his kingdom was about to crumble beneath the weight of a single revelation. Sophia Martinez had reached her breaking point, the moral weight of her complicity finally overcoming her fear of professional consequences. Her hands trembled as she looked down at her computer screen one more time, seeing Daniela's executive override status glowing there like an accusation, like a reminder of everything she'd been taught about right and wrong before the cruel mathematics of employment security had taught her to calculate differently. Sir Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough conviction to cut through the tension that filled the space between the reception desk and the small crowd of witnesses. "I need to tell you something." Crawford turned toward her with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent years training subordinates to follow his lead. Without question, his expression already hardening at the possibility of insubordination. "Not now, Sophia," he said curtly. "We're handling a situation here." But Sophia had found something inside herself that was stronger than fear, some core of integrity that refused to be compromised any further. She turned her computer monitor toward Crawford, the screen displaying information that made his face go pale. "She's in the system, sir," Sophia said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Executive override status, corporate authentication, everything checks out perfectly." The words hit Crawford like a physical blow, but instead of backing down, instead of acknowledging the evidence that was literally staring him in the face, he doubled down on his authority with the desperation of someone who understood that admitting error now would mean admitting to everything that had led up to this moment. "That's impossible," he snapped, his voice carrying across the lobby with enough force to draw attention from guests who'd been trying to mind their own business. "You're reading it wrong, or there's some kind of system error. People like her don't have executive access to our premium accommodations." The phrase "people like her" landed in the space between them like a bomb so explicitly discriminatory that even the most willfully oblivious observer couldn't pretend not to understand what was happening. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her legal training compelling her to intervene in what had clearly become a civil rights violation unfolding in real time. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent fighting exactly this kind of injustice, "you're making a very serious mistake, and you're making it in front of witnesses with recording devices." Crawford's attention snapped toward her, his frustration and growing panic finding a new target. "Ma'am, I've asked you once already to stay out of matters that don't concern you," he said, his professional veneer finally beginning to crack under the pressure of a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. "Discrimination concerns everyone, Doctor," Williams replied evenly, "especially when it's being practiced by businesses that serve the public and claim to welcome guests without regard to race or ethnicity." Maya Patel's phone screen showed that her live stream had reached nearly 25,000 viewers, comments flooding in from people across the country who were witnessing this confrontation in real time. The hashtag Platinum Royal Racism had begun trending, and news outlets were already reaching out through her social media accounts, recognizing that they were seeing something that would demand coverage and investigation. Crawford's breathing had become more rapid, more shallow, the kind of physiological response that comes when someone realizes they're losing control of a situation that they'd assumed they could manage. He'd built his career on the assumption that his authority within this space was absolute, that his judgment about who belonged and who didn't would never be seriously challenged, and the sudden presence of witnesses, recording devices, and expert legal analysis had created a reality he wasn't equipped to handle. Security Crawford called, his voice cracking slightly as he reached for the phone at the reception desk. "I need security at the front desk immediately." But even as he made the call, even as he doubled down on his decision to treat Daniela as an unwelcome intruder rather than a legitimate guest, something in his expression betrayed his growing awareness that he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. The way Sophia was looking at him, the way Dr. Williams was taking notes, the way other guests were recording and whispering, it all added up to a moment of reckoning that he wasn't prepared to face. Daniela had remained perfectly still throughout this escalation, watching Crawford reveal himself, completely documenting every word and gesture for what she knew would be a comprehensive review of not just this incident but the culture that had made it possible. When she finally spoke, her voice was so calm, so controlled that it seemed to command the attention of everyone in the lobby. "Mr. Crawford," she said, using his name for the first time, a detail that sent a small shock of recognition through him. "You should know that your decision to treat me this way isn't just being witnessed by these guests. It's being recorded by security cameras documented in your own hotel's surveillance system, and it will be reviewed by people with the authority to determine whether your employment here continues." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that Crawford felt something cold settle in his stomach, some growing awareness that this guest might not be as powerless as he'd assumed. But pride and prejudice are powerful forces, and instead of stepping back from the precipice he'd created, Crawford took one final devastating step forward. His hand moved faster than his mind could process the consequences, the slap echoing through the marble lobby like a gunshot, leaving a red mark across Daniela's cheek, and a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow all the sound in the world. The sound of Richard Crawford's hand striking Daniela Chen's face echoed through the Platinum Royal's lobby like a church bell tolling judgment, a single note that seemed to hang in the air long after the physical impact had ended. In the seconds that followed, the marble cathedral of wealth and privilege became something else entirely, a courtroom where truth would finally have its day. Daniela didn't stagger backward from the blow. She didn't cry out or raise her hand to her cheek where the red mark was already blooming like a flower across her dark skin. She simply turned her head back toward Crawford, her eyes meeting his with a composure so complete, so devastating in its calm certainty, that he immediately understood he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The guests scattered throughout the lobby had frozen in positions of shock and disbelief, their phones raised like weapons, capturing every moment of what they instinctively knew would become something much larger than a single act of violence. Maya Patel's live stream had exploded to over 50,000 viewers as word spread across social media platforms that something extraordinary was happening at this Seattle hotel, something that would likely make national news before the day was over. "Security," Crawford shouted, his voice breaking with the desperation of someone who'd just realized the magnitude of what he'd done but was too committed to his course of action to change direction. "I want this woman removed from the property immediately." But the two security guards who'd responded to his earlier call, James Wilson and Maria Santos, both African-American employees who'd worked for Grandview for over 5 years, stood motionless at the edge of the lobby, their radios silent in their hands. They had witnessed the entire confrontation, seen the escalation from routine discrimination to outright assault, and neither was willing to follow orders that would make them complicit in something they recognized as fundamentally wrong. Sophia Martinez had stepped back from the reception desk, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the true cost of her earlier silence. She'd tried to protect her job by going along with Crawford's obvious bias, but in doing so, she'd become part of something that had culminated in physical violence against a guest who had done nothing more than attempt to check into a hotel room she'd legitimately reserved. "I saw everything," Sophia said, her voice trembling, but clear enough to carry across the suddenly quiet lobby. She never touched him. She never raised her voice. She never did anything that would justify what just happened. Dr. Patricia Williams moved closer to Daniela, her 4 decades of civil rights experience compelling her to document what she'd witnessed, and to position herself as a barrier between the victim and any further violence. "Young lady," she said gently to Daniela, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Daniela shook her head slightly, her attention focused entirely on Crawford, who was still standing behind the reception desk with his hand raised as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. The man who'd thought himself the king of this marble kingdom was beginning to understand that he might instead be its destroyer, that his single moment of violence might bring down everything he'd worked to build over his 12 years of employment. "You just made an irreversible decision," Daniela said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that seemed to command attention from every person in the lobby. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who watched it happen and chose their response." The words carried implications that went far beyond the immediate moment, suggesting consequences that would ripple outward from this single incident, like stones thrown into still water. Crawford's breathing had become rapid and shallow, his professional composure finally cracking completely as he realized that the comfortable certainty of his authority had been replaced by something much more dangerous: the unknown consequences of actions that couldn't be undone. Jessica Torres, who'd been standing beside Sophia throughout the entire confrontation, began backing away from the reception desk as she realized that her earlier comments about Daniela finding a more suitable hotel had been captured on multiple recording devices and would likely be scrutinized alongside Crawford's more obvious violations. The casual cruelty she'd participated in was about to become evidence in a case that would extend far beyond this lobby. Around the edges of the lobby, other guests had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their phones creating a digital record of everything that had transpired. A businessman who'd been checking his email near the elevator had recorded the entire escalation from Crawford's initial discriminatory questions through the final moment of violence. An elderly couple from Portland had captured audio of the most damaging statements, their phones positioned to record not just the assault itself, but the context that had led up to it. Maya's social media followers were posting and reposting clips of the confrontation across every platform, their outrage and disbelief creating a viral moment that was already attracting attention from news outlets and civil rights organizations. The hashtag Platinum Royal Assault was trending nationally, and Maya's phone was buzzing with interview requests from reporters who recognized that this story would dominate news cycles for days to come. But perhaps the most significant witness to Crawford's actions was the hotel's own security system, the network of cameras that had captured every word, every gesture, every moment of discrimination and violence from multiple angles. The digital evidence was already being stored on servers that would preserve this incident long after the immediate shock had faded, creating a permanent record that would be analyzed by lawyers, investigators, and corporate executives who would need to determine how such a catastrophic failure of training and oversight had been allowed to occur. Dr. Williams had pulled out a notebook and was writing down the exact time, the names of visible witnesses, and the specific sequence of events that had led to the assault, her legal training compelling her to create documentation that would be useful in whatever investigations would follow. She'd seen enough discrimination cases to understand that the quality of evidence gathered in the immediate aftermath would determine the strength of any legal action that might result from this incident. Crawford looked around the lobby and saw his career dissolving in real time, reflected in the faces of witnesses who'd watched him reveal himself completely. But he still didn't understand the true scope of what he'd done, still didn't realize that the woman he'd just assaulted possessed the power to transform not just his individual fate, but the culture of the entire company that employed him. Daniela Chen reached into her pocket and withdrew her phone with the deliberate calm of someone who'd been preparing for this moment long before she'd walked through the Platinum Royal's doors. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced precision, placing a call that would transform everything Crawford thought he understood about power, authority, and consequences. "Carmen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the marble lobby. "Protocol 7. Authorization Chen Delta 9. Location the Platinum Royal Seattle. Full documentation review and immediate implementation. The response came through the phone's speaker, crisp and professional and loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear clearly. Confirmed, Miss Chen. Protocol 7 activated. Legal team notified. Security recording initiated. All relevant personnel standing by for further instructions. Crawford's face had drained of color as he heard the exchange. Some primitive instinct warning him that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple guest complaint. The calm efficiency of the voice on the phone suggested corporate authority at the highest levels, the kind of power that could end careers with a single directive. "What's Protocol 7? Sophia whispered, but her question was answered almost immediately as every computer terminal at the reception desk began flashing with automated notifications. The hotel's internal communication system had activated sending priority alerts to every department head, every manager, every employee with supervisory responsibility. Carmen Rodriguez, Daniela's assistant, had been monitoring the situation through the hotel's own security cameras ever since Daniela had sent her a discreet text 20 minutes earlier. From her office in Grandview's Seattle headquarters, she'd watched the entire confrontation unfold with growing alarm, documenting every discriminatory statement, every escalation, every moment that would need to be included in the comprehensive report that was already being compiled for legal review. Miss Chen Carmen's voice continued through the speaker. "I'm showing full verification of your identity and authority through biometric recognition. Hotel management systems are now responding to your executive override commands. Shall I proceed with personnel security protocols?" The words hit Crawford like a series of physical blows as he began to understand what he'd missed, what his assumptions had blinded him to seeing. Executive override commands, biometric recognition, personnel security protocols. This wasn't a guest complaint department handling a difficult customer. This was corporate authority at the highest possible level. Sophia's computer screen had changed completely, displaying a priority message that made her gasp audibly. CEO. Presence confirmed. All personnel maintain highest professional standards pending executive review. Below that, in smaller text but equally devastating discrimination incident under investigation. Preserve all documentation. Dr. Williams, whose legal expertise had immediately recognized the significance of what she was witnessing, moved closer to get a better view of the computer screens that were revealing the truth Crawford had been too blinded by prejudice to see. "Young lady," she said to Daniela with dawning understanding, "exactly who are you?" But before Daniela could answer, the hotel's public address system activated with a soft chime that every Grandview employee was trained to recognize as a corporate priority announcement. Carmen's voice filled the entire lobby, professional and uncompromising. "This is a message for all Platinum Royal personnel. Executive leadership is on site, conducting operational review. All interactions are being monitored and recorded for quality assurance and legal compliance. Any violations of company policy regarding guest treatment will result in immediate termination and possible legal action." The announcement sent shockwaves through the staff members who were beginning to gather at the edges of the lobby, drawn by the growing commotion, but now understanding that they were witnessing something that would likely define their careers for years to come. Several employees who'd been working nearby during the confrontation began backing away desperately, hoping they hadn't been caught on camera participating in or ignoring the discrimination they'd witnessed. Crawford's hands were shaking as he reached for his own computer terminal, desperately trying to log into systems that might give him some leverage, some way to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him with each passing second. But his screen displayed only an error message: access suspended pending executive review. Contact corporate human resources for clarification. Maya Patel's phone showed that her live stream had reached over 75,000 viewers, as news of the unfolding drama spread across social media platforms. Comments were flowing so rapidly that the text was blurring, but the sentiment was clear. People around the country were watching a real-time accountability moment, the kind of instant justice that rarely happened but was all the more powerful when it did. Ma'am James Wilson, the security guard who'd been watching from the edge of the lobby, approached Daniela with obvious respect. "I want you to know that myself and Officer Santos witnessed everything that happened here. Mr. Crawford's actions don't represent the values that most of us try to uphold in this workplace." The statement was carefully worded but devastating in its implications, a clear indication that Crawford's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that other employees had observed and disapproved of, but felt powerless to address through normal channels. Crawford tried one more desperate play for authority, reaching for the desk phone to call what he assumed would be his supervisors at the regional office. But when he lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. Just Carmen's voice, calm and implacable. "Mr. Crawford, your access to external communications has been suspended pending the completion of this investigation. Please step away from the reception desk and wait for further instructions from Human Resources." The technological precision of his isolation was breathtaking. Within minutes of Daniela's phone call, Crawford had been cut off from every system that had given him power, every channel through which he might have tried to control the narrative or minimize the consequences of his actions. He stood behind the reception desk like a general whose army had abandoned him, surrounded by the evidence of his own downfall. But the most devastating revelation was still to come, the moment when Crawford would finally understand not just that he'd assaulted a guest, but exactly who that guest was and what kind of power he'd chosen to attack. The moment of truth arrived with the quiet inevitability of sunrise transforming the Platinum Royals lobby from a scene of discrimination and violence into something that would be remembered as a turning point in corporate accountability and social justice. Daniela Chen straightened her shoulders, her hand still holding the phone that connected her to the vast network of power she'd built over 2 decades of refusing to accept that success belonged only to people who looked different from her. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice carrying across the marble expanse with perfect clarity. "Allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Daniela Chen, Chief Executive Officer of Grandview Hospitality Group. You work for me. This hotel belongs to me, and you just assaulted your boss in her own property." The words hit the lobby like a seismic shift, reordering everything that everyone present thought they understood about power, authority, and consequences. Crawford's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally pure terror, as his mind processed the magnitude of what Daniela had just revealed. Sofia Martinez let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, as she realized that the woman she'd helped discriminate against the guest she'd lied to about system irregularities was not just a customer, but the person who ultimately determined whether Grandview Hospitality continued to exist. Her hands flew to her face as the full weight of her complicity crashed down on her. Dr. Williams, whose legal expertise had prepared her for many shocking revelations over her career, found herself genuinely amazed by the scope of what had just been disclosed. In 40 years of civil rights law, she said to Maya Patel, whose phone was capturing every word, "I have never witnessed anything quite like this." Crawford's mouth moved soundlessly as he struggled to form words to find some response that might minimize the career-ending catastrophe he'd created for himself. But there was nothing to say, no explanation that could account for the depth of his error, no apology that could undo the assault he'd committed against the woman who could destroy his professional future with a single phone call. "This isn't possible," he whispered, the words barely audible but caught by multiple recording devices that were documenting every moment of his downfall. "You can't be. You don't look like—" Like what Daniela asked quietly, her composure more devastating than any show of anger could have been. Like someone who built a company from nothing. Like someone who earned her position through talent and determination, rather than having it handed to her. Like someone who understands that real leadership means creating environments where everyone is treated with dignity. The questions hung in the air like indictments, each one highlighting the assumptions Crawford had made, the biases he'd acted on, the prejudices that had convinced him he could treat Daniela as less than human without facing consequences. Carmen's voice came through the phone speaker again, providing confirmation that sent another shockwave through the assembled witnesses. Miss Chen, I've confirmed your identity through multiple verification systems. Grandview board members are standing by for your executive briefing. Shall I initiate immediate personnel action protocols? Maya's social media followers had pushed her live stream to over 150,000 viewers as the story exploded across multiple platforms. The hashtag Grandview CEO was trending nationally alongside hashtag Justice. At Platinum, and her phone was buzzing with interview requests from every major news network in the country. She was witnessing the kind of real-time accountability moment that rarely happened in corporate America, the instant when power revealed itself in service of justice rather than self-interest. "Oh my God," Jessica Torres whispered as the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. She'd spent the last hour participating in the discrimination and humiliation of her company's chief executive officer, captured on video that was already being viewed by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. James Wilson and Maria Santos, the security guards who'd refused to follow Crawford's orders, exchanged looks that carried both relief and vindication. Their instinct to resist participating in what they'd recognized as wrong had likely saved their careers, while their colleagues who'd gone along with Crawford's bias were facing an uncertain future. Dr. Williams had begun taking notes with the focused intensity of someone who understood that she was witnessing history being made, that this moment would be studied in business schools and civil rights courses for decades to come, as an example of how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. The system access you saw on Sophia's computer wasn't a glitch. Daniela continued, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was executive override status, the highest level of authentication in our company's reservation system. The corporate codes weren't fake. They were generated by the same office that signs your paychecks and determines your employment status. Crawford finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a broken whisper. "I didn't know. How could I have known? You couldn't have known who I was," Daniela replied. "But you should have known how to treat any guest with basic human dignity. The fact that you're only concerned about your behavior now that you understand my position tells me everything I need to know about your character and your fitness for any role in this company." The indictment was surgical in its precision, cutting through any possible excuse Crawford might have offered and exposing the fundamental flaw in his thinking. That respect was something to be calculated based on perceived status rather than offered as a basic human right. Around the lobby, other hotel employees had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion, but now frozen in horror as they realized they were watching their general manager's career end in real time, his authority dissolving like sugar in water as the true hierarchy of power revealed itself. Carmen's voice provided the final confirmation that sealed Crawford's fate. "Miss Chen, I have legal counsel standing by to discuss assault charges, human resources prepared to initiate immediate termination procedures, and our crisis communication team ready to manage media response. How would you like to proceed?" The question hung in the air like a judge's gavel waiting to fall, the final moment before consequences became reality, and Crawford's 12 years at Grandview Hospitality came to an end not with recognition or retirement, but with shame and legal jeopardy that would follow him for the rest of his career. The transformation of the Platinum Royals lobby from a scene of discrimination to a theater of justice continued with the methodical precision of a machine built for accountability. Daniela Chen held her phone with steady hands as the corporate apparatus she'd built over 20 years of refusing to accept inequality began to systematically dismantle the career of the man who'd thought himself untouchable within his small kingdom of marble and gold. Carmen Daniela said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had built an empire spanning 6 continents, proceed with immediate termination protocols for Richard Crawford, General Manager, and Jessica Torres, Senior Receptionist. Authorization: Chen Alpha 7. The response came through the speaker with devastating efficiency. Termination protocols activated. Building access revoked. Corporate communications suspended. Final paycheck processing initiated. Security escort authorized. Crawford watched in real time as his empire crumbled, each corporate system turning against him with the same cold efficiency he'd used to exclude guests he'd deemed unworthy of his hospitality. His keycard had already stopped working, the red light on his badge scanner serving as a digital death certificate for his career. His company email had been deactivated, cutting him off from the professional networks he'd spent 12 years building. Sophia Martinez, who'd been standing frozen beside the reception desk throughout this revelation, found her voice as she realized that her moment of moral failure might not have to define her entire future. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I need you to know that I saw your override status on my computer from the very beginning. I knew you had legitimate access, and I lied about it because I was afraid of losing my job." The confession was devastating in its honesty, but it was also the first step toward redemption, the moment when someone chose truth over self-preservation, even when the consequences might be severe. Daniela studied Sophia's face, seeing something there that reminded her of her own struggles as a young woman trying to find her way in industries that weren't designed to welcome people like her. "What you did was wrong," Daniela said finally. "But the fact that you're admitting it now without being forced to tells me something important about your character. You're promoted to Interim Guest Services Manager, effective immediately. Use this second chance to build the kind of workplace you'd want your own daughter to work in someday." The mercy was unexpected, powerful in its generosity, and it sent shockwaves through the assembled witnesses who'd expected only punishment to flow from this corporate reckoning. Sophia began crying again, but these tears carried gratitude and relief rather than shame and fear. Dr. Williams, who'd spent 4 decades fighting for justice in courtrooms and boardrooms, recognized what she was witnessing as something rare and precious. The moment when power chose to heal rather than simply punish, when accountability created opportunity for growth rather than just destruction. Crawford made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. "Miss Chen, please," he said, his voice breaking as he realized that his professional life was ending in front of cameras that would preserve his humiliation forever. "I've worked for this company for 12 years. I've been a loyal employee. Surely this can be resolved without destroying my entire career." Daniela's expression didn't change as she considered his plea, but when she spoke, her words carried the weight of every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every guest who'd been made to feel small in spaces designed to elevate the human spirit. "Your loyalty was to your own prejudices, not to this company's values," she said. "For 12 years, you've been creating experiences that damaged our brand and harmed our guests. And the fact that no one stopped you tells me that our oversight systems failed as badly as your leadership did." Carmen's voice provided the operational details that would transform words into action. "Miss Chen security personnel are en route to escort terminated employees from the building. Legal department has prepared preliminary documentation for assault charges if you choose to proceed. HR has initiated company-wide review of management practices to prevent similar incidents." The scope of the response was breathtaking. Within 30 minutes of Crawford's assault, Grandview Hospitality had mobilized legal, security, human resources, and communications teams to address not just this individual incident, but the cultural failures that had made it possible. This wasn't just corporate damage control. It was institutional transformation happening in real time. Maya Patel's phone showed that her live stream had reached over 200,000 viewers as news outlets began picking up the story and amplifying it across their own platforms. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Daniela's response, with viewers expressing amazement at witnessing corporate accountability happening with such immediate clarity. James Wilson, the security guard who'd refused to follow Crawford's discriminatory orders, approached Daniela with obvious respect. "Ma'am," he said, "I want you to know that what we witnessed today wasn't isolated. There have been other incidents, other times when guests were treated differently based on assumptions about who they were or where they belonged." The revelation confirmed what Daniela had suspected, what had driven her to make these unannounced visits in the first place. Crawford's behavior wasn't an aberration, but part of a pattern that had been allowed to flourish because oversight systems were inadequate and accountability measures were toothless. "That changes today," Daniela said, addressing not just James but the growing crowd of hotel employees who'd gathered to witness this unprecedented scene. Grandview Hospitality exists to create experiences that honor human dignity, and anyone who can't commit to that mission doesn't belong in this organization. The promise carried the weight of institutional transformation, the beginning of changes that would ripple through every property, every training program, every hiring decision that Grandview made going forward. What had started as one man's moment of violence had become a catalyst for comprehensive reform. Crawford and Jessica were escorted from the building they'd thought they controlled. Their careers ended not by budget cuts or corporate restructuring, but by their own choices, their own failures to see the humanity in someone they'd assumed was powerless. As the glass doors closed behind them, everyone remaining in the lobby understood that they'd witnessed something rare and significant. Justice, served with both swiftness and precision accountability, delivered with the kind of moral clarity that rarely existed in corporate America. Within 6 hours of Maya Patel's live stream capturing Daniela Chen's revelation in the Platinum Royals lobby, the story had exploded across every major media platform in North America, with the unstoppable force of truth finally being allowed to breathe. The video had been viewed over 2 million times, shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens who recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Corporate accountability delivered with surgical precision. CNN's Anderson Cooper led his evening broadcast with the story, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the historical significance of what had transpired. Tonight, a shocking confrontation at a luxury Seattle hotel has become a viral sensation and a powerful example of how discrimination can be met with immediate consequences when the person being targeted has the power to demand justice. The network aired Maya's footage alongside expert analysis from civil rights attorneys who parsed every moment of Crawford's behavior from his initial discriminatory questions through the final assault that had ended his career. Legal experts agreed that the case would become a landmark study in corporate responsibility and individual accountability. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow devoted an entire segment to dissecting the business implications of Daniela's response, noting how Grandview's stock price had jumped 12% in after-hours trading as investors recognized that the company's commitment to inclusive practices would likely protect it from the boycotts and public relations disasters that had destroyed other hospitality brands in recent years. Fox News found itself in the unusual position of praising corporate leadership that aligned with conservative values of personal responsibility and consequences for poor behavior with Tucker Carlson, noting that sometimes justice looks exactly like what happened in that hotel lobby, swift, clear, and completely proportional to the offense committed. Social media had become a digital wildfire, spreading the story across platforms at unprecedented speed. On Twitter, #GrandviewJustice and #Daniela Chen were trending worldwide with over 500,000 tweets sharing the video, analyzing the corporate response, and celebrating what many saw as a perfect example of how power should be used to protect dignity rather than enforce hierarchy. Instagram influencers with millions of followers were sharing the story alongside personal accounts of their own experiences with discrimination in luxury establishments, creating a broader conversation about bias in the hospitality industry that extended far beyond this single incident. TikTok had exploded with reaction videos from users around the world, many of whom shared their own stories of being made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. The hashtag I am Daniela Chen had been viewed over 50 million times as people connected her experience to their own encounters with prejudice and exclusion. Traditional news outlets scrambled to provide context and background for a story that seemed to capture something essential about justice, power, and accountability in modern America. The Washington Post ran a front-page story tracing Daniela's journey from foster care to billionaire CEO, emphasizing how her personal experience with discrimination had shaped her corporate philosophy and prepared her to respond with such decisive action. The New York Times business section featured an analysis of how Daniela's immediate response had likely saved Grandview Hospitality millions of dollars in potential litigation boycotts and reputation damage, while also creating a template for other companies facing similar crises of bias and exclusion. Entertainment Tonight and other celebrity news programs picked up the story as Hollywood figures began weighing in on social media, with Oprah Winfrey tweeting, "This is what accountability looks like when the person with power refuses to let injustice stand." Daniela Chen didn't just fire an employee. She sent a message about values that will echo through corporate America. The international media response was equally swift and comprehensive, with BBC News running the story as an example of American corporate culture evolving to address racial bias more directly, while Canadian outlets emphasized how the incident reflected broader discussions about inclusion and equality in the business world. Richard Crawford's background became the subject of intense media scrutiny, with investigative reporters uncovering a pattern of discrimination complaints at his previous positions that had been handled through quiet settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The Seattle Times published a comprehensive investigation showing how Crawford's behavior at the Platinum Royal was part of a longer history of treating guests differently based on racial assumptions. Jessica Torres found herself facing similar scrutiny with her social media history, revealing posts and comments that suggested her participation in the lobby discrimination wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of bias that she'd expressed privately online for years. Meanwhile, Sofia Martinez became an unexpected hero in the narrative, her decision to speak truth in the moment of crisis, resonating with viewers who saw her moral courage as an example of how individual employees could help transform institutional culture by choosing integrity over self-preservation. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose legal expertise had provided crucial witness testimony, found herself in demand as a commentator on news programs across the political spectrum, her analysis of the incident lending credibility and context to discussions about discrimination, accountability, and justice in corporate America. Maya Patel's social media following had exploded to over 500,000 across platforms as people recognized her role in documenting this historic moment of accountability. Documentary producers and book publishers were reaching out with offers to help her tell the broader story of how social media could serve as a force for transparency and justice. But perhaps the most significant media response came from business publications like Forbes' Harvard Business Review and the Wall Street Journal, which recognized that Daniela's handling of the crisis represented a new model for corporate leadership that prioritized authentic values over public relations damage control. The story had become more than news. It had become a cultural moment that forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about power prejudice and the possibility of justice when the right person refuses to accept the unacceptable. The aftermath of Richard Crawford's public downfall rippled through the lives of everyone connected to the Platinum Royal incident, with the devastating precision of truth finally allowed to speak its name. In his modest suburban home 30 miles outside Seattle, Crawford sat in his darkened living room at 2 a.m. watching his career dissolve in real time as news coverage of his assault on Daniela Chen dominated every channel. His wife Sarah had learned about his firing the same way the rest of the world had, through social media alerts that showed her husband's face alongside words like racist assault and terminated for cause. The woman who'd spent 15 years building a life with him suddenly found herself confronting the uncomfortable reality that the man she'd married had been capable of the behavior she'd witnessed on Maya Patel's viral video. "How long has this been who you are?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone whose entire understanding of her marriage had just been rewritten by 20 minutes of footage from a hotel lobby. "How many times have you treated people this way when I wasn't watching Crawford's 17-year-old daughter Emma had faced her own reckoning at school, where classmates who'd seen the viral video confronted her with questions about her father's behavior that she had no way to answer?" The teenager who'd been proud of her father's position at a luxury hotel found herself defending actions that were indefensible, trying to reconcile the man who'd coached her soccer team with the person who'd assaulted a guest on camera. "Dad," Emma said when she came home from school that first day, her eyes red from crying. "Everyone's asking me if you're really a racist. What am I supposed to tell them?" The question hung in the suburban silence like an accusation, forcing Crawford to confront not just what he'd done, but what his actions meant for the family that had trusted him to represent their values in the world. The comfortable assumptions that had guided his professional behavior had destroyed not just his career, but his daughter's sense of security and his wife's faith in their partnership. Jessica Torres faced her own family crisis when her elderly parents, immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to put her through community college and into her hospitality career, saw their daughter's face alongside Crawford's on Spanish-language news programs that had picked up the story as an example of workplace discrimination in corporate America. "Mija?" Her father said, his voice carrying the disappointment of someone who'd sacrificed everything to give his daughter opportunities he'd never had. "How could you treat someone the way we were treated when we first came to this country? How could you forget where you came from?" The question cut deeper than any corporate punishment could have, forcing Jessica to confront how her desire to fit into professional environments had led her to participate in the same kind of exclusion that her own family had faced as newcomers to America. Sophia Martinez, meanwhile, found herself processing a completely different kind of emotional upheaval as her family celebrated her unexpected promotion and the courage she'd shown in finally speaking truth to power. Her parents, who'd worked as housekeeping staff at various hotels throughout her childhood, wept with pride as they watched news coverage that portrayed their daughter as someone who'd chosen integrity over security. "We always taught you to speak up for what's right," her mother said, holding Sophia as they watched CNN's coverage of the incident even when we were too afraid to do it ourselves in our own jobs. "You honored our family and our values." Dr. Patricia Williams found herself energized by the incident in ways she hadn't expected, her 4 decades of civil rights work suddenly feeling more relevant and immediate than they had in years. The retired attorney who'd thought her fighting days were behind her realized that witnessing justice in real time had reignited her passion for advocacy and change. "In all my years practicing law," she told her daughter during their weekly phone call, "I've rarely seen accountability delivered with such swift precision. It reminded me why I chose this work in the first place. Because sometimes the arc of justice bends exactly the way it's supposed to." Maya Patel discovered that documenting this moment of accountability had transformed her from a travel blogger with modest following into a voice for transparency and justice that resonated with hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from major networks, but also with messages from ordinary people sharing their own stories of discrimination and exclusion. "I thought I was just recording another travel industry complaint," she told her parents during a video call to Mumbai. "But somehow I ended up documenting something that people are calling a turning point in corporate accountability." James Wilson and Maria Santos, the security guards who'd refused to follow Crawford's discriminatory orders, found themselves being praised as examples of moral courage by colleagues and community members who recognized that their decision to resist had likely saved their careers and their integrity. "My grandmother always told me that doing the right thing would protect me better than following bad orders," James told his wife as they watched news coverage of the incident. but I never expected it to happen so dramatically. Even the guests who'd witnessed the confrontation found themselves processing complex emotions about their role as observers of injustice, wondering whether they could have done more to intervene before the situation escalated to violence. The travel blogger from Portland, who'd recorded crucial audio of Crawford's discriminatory statements, found herself questioning how many similar incidents she'd witnessed over the years without speaking up. How many times she'd allowed bias to pass unchallenged because it didn't directly affect her. But perhaps the most significant personal reckoning belonged to Daniela Chen herself, who spent the evening after the incident walking through the streets of Seattle processing what it meant to have used her power so publicly, so decisively in service of values that she'd carried since childhood, but had rarely been forced to defend so dramatically. The little girl who'd slept in a car after being excluded from a hotel had grown into a woman capable of transforming corporate culture with a single phone call. But the weight of that power carried responsibilities that extended far beyond any individual incident of discrimination or justice. The transformation of Grandview Hospitality Group began at 6 a.m. the morning after the Platinum Royal incident, when Daniela Chen convened an emergency video conference with her executive leadership team division heads and regional managers from around the world. The faces on her conference room screen represented 47,000 employees across 6 continents, all of whom would be affected by the decisions made in the next 72 hours. What happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. Daniela began her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent the night reviewing incident reports, guest complaints, and employee surveys that painted a disturbing picture of cultural failures across multiple properties. It was a symptom of deeper problems that we're going to address comprehensively starting today. The Dignity Protocol, she announced, would become the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in the hospitality industry, requiring every employee from housekeeping staff to executive management to complete 40 hours of intensive education about unconscious bias, inclusive practices, and the business value of authentic hospitality that honored every guest regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Carmen Rodriguez, whose efficient coordination of the previous day's corporate response had demonstrated the power of proper preparation, was promoted to Chief Operating Officer with specific responsibility for implementing cultural transformation across all Grandview properties. Her first directive was to establish guest feedback systems that would identify discrimination patterns before they could escalate to public incidents. Sofia Martinez, whose moral courage in speaking truth at the crucial moment had earned her promotion from trainee to interim manager, found herself at the center of a pilot program that would test new inclusive hospitality standards at the Platinum Royal before rolling them out company-wide. Her background as someone who'd initially failed the moral test but then chosen redemption made her uniquely qualified to help other employees navigate similar challenges. Dr. Patricia Williams accepted Daniela's invitation to join Grandview's board of directors as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Advisor, bringing 4 decades of civil rights expertise to the challenge of transforming corporate culture at scale. Her first recommendation was to establish an independent review board with the authority to investigate discrimination complaints and recommend consequences up to and including termination. The changes weren't limited to policy and training. Daniela authorized a complete review of hiring practices, promotion criteria, and performance evaluation standards to identify where bias might be influencing personnel decisions. The goal was to create advancement pathways for employees who demonstrated inclusive values while ensuring that discriminatory behavior would be career-limiting regardless of other performance metrics. Within a week, Grandview had implemented new guest services protocols that required 2-person verification for any decision to deny accommodations or remove guests from properties, creating accountability measures that would prevent individual employees from acting on personal bias without oversight. The company's recruitment strategy shifted dramatically with new partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions and organizations supporting LGBTQ+ professionals in hospitality. The goal was to build a workforce that reflected the diversity of the communities Grandview served, ensuring that guests would encounter faces and voices that looked like their own throughout their travel experiences. Richard Crawford's termination had created an opportunity to restructure management practices across all Grandview properties, with new requirements for diversity and inclusion competency as prerequisites for any supervisory role. Managers would be evaluated not just on financial performance, but on their ability to create inclusive environments that maximized the potential of every employee and honored the dignity of every guest. Maya Patel's viral documentation of the incident had demonstrated the power of transparency in holding corporate leadership accountable, leading Daniela to establish new social media monitoring and response protocols that would allow the company to identify and address problems before they became public relations disasters. The ripple effects extended beyond Grandview as competitor companies scrambled to review their own practices and avoid becoming the next viral example of corporate discrimination. Marriott, Hilton, and other major hotel chains announced new bias training initiatives, guest feedback systems, and diversity hiring goals in response to the industry-wide scrutiny generated by the Platinum Royal incident. The American Hotel and Lodging Association called an emergency meeting of industry leaders to develop new standards for preventing discrimination in hospitality settings, with many executives privately acknowledging that Daniela's decisive response had forced a long overdue reckoning with problems that had been ignored or minimized for decades. University business schools began reaching out to Daniela and her team to document the corporate transformation process as a case study in crisis management, authentic leadership, and the business value of inclusive practices. Harvard Business School announced plans to feature the incident in its required coursework for MBA students studying organizational behavior and corporate responsibility. The Congressional Black Caucus and other civil rights organizations praised Grandview's response as a model for how corporate America could address workplace discrimination proactively rather than reactively, with several members of Congress citing the company's rapid transformation as evidence that meaningful change was possible when leadership was committed to authentic rather than performative inclusion. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than procedural. The understanding throughout Grandview's organization that the company's values weren't just marketing language, but enforceable standards that would be upheld regardless of the personal comfort or preferences of individual employees. The message was clear. Grandview hospitality existed to create experiences that honored human dignity, and anyone who couldn't embrace that mission would find employment elsewhere. The transformation was comprehensive, immediate, and designed to ensure that what had happened to Daniela Chen could never happen to any guest again. The transformation, sparked by 27 minutes of confrontation in the Platinum Royal's lobby, had grown beyond corporate policy changes into a movement that was reshaping entire industries and inspiring individuals across the country to demand accountability from institutions that had previously operated without meaningful oversight or consequences. Within 6 months, the hospitality industry had undergone the most comprehensive examination of discriminatory practices in its history, driven not by government regulation but by market forces and consumer demand for authentic inclusion. Hotels, restaurants, airlines, and rental car companies found themselves competing on inclusion metrics as travelers increasingly chose companies that could demonstrate genuine commitment to treating all customers with equal dignity and respect. The Platinum Royal effect became business school shorthand for how viral social media content could force immediate corporate accountability, with companies across multiple industries developing crisis response protocols designed to address discrimination incidents before they could explode into public relations disasters that destroyed brand value and market position. Marriott International announced a $50 million investment in bias training and inclusive hiring practices, while Hilton partnered with the NAACP to develop new standards for guest services that would be implemented across their global portfolio. Even cruise lines and vacation rental platforms adopted new policies requiring diversity training for all customer-facing employees. The legal profession had taken notice as well, with civil rights attorneys citing the incident as evidence that documentation through social media could provide unprecedented power for discrimination victims to seek immediate rather than delayed justice. Law schools began incorporating social media documentation strategies into their civil rights curriculum, recognizing that platforms like Instagram and TikTok had become tools for accountability that complemented traditional legal remedies. Richard Crawford's attempts to find new employment in hospitality had been unsuccessful, with his viral termination serving as a warning to other companies about the reputational risks of hiring employees with documented histories of discriminatory behavior. The man who'd once wielded authority over a luxury hotel found himself working as a customer service representative at a call center, his career permanently altered by 30 seconds of violence captured on video. However, Crawford's story had also become one of attempted redemption, as he'd entered therapy to address the biases that had led to his downfall, and begun volunteering with a nonprofit organization that provided sensitivity training to businesses seeking to improve their inclusive practices. His therapist specialized in helping executives confront unconscious bias, and Crawford's willingness to examine his own prejudices had become part of a healing process that might eventually allow him to contribute positively to conversations about workplace discrimination. Jessica Torres had found a different path to redemption, enrolling in diversity and inclusion certification programs while working for a community organization that helped immigrants navigate workplace discrimination. Her personal experience with participating in bias had given her unique insights into how prejudice operated in professional settings and how it could be addressed through education and accountability. Sophia Martinez had leveraged her newfound prominence into acceptance to Grandview's executive training program, with her story inspiring other young employees to speak up when they witnessed discrimination rather than staying silent out of fear for their own career security. Her promotion from trainee to management had become a symbol of how moral courage could be rewarded rather than punished in companies committed to authentic values. Dr. Patricia Williams had used her position on Grandview's board to establish a legal aid fund that provided free representation for hospitality workers facing discrimination, with the fund's first annual report documenting over 200 successful interventions that had prevented discrimination from escalating to termination or assault. Maya Patel had parlayed her documentation of the incident into a multimedia company focused on social justice storytelling, with her first documentary, The Slap That Changed Everything, winning awards at film festivals around the world and inspiring other content creators to use their platforms for accountability journalism rather than just entertainment. The federal government had taken notice as well, with the Department of Justice announcing new guidelines for investigating discrimination in public accommodations, and Congress holding hearings on the role of social media in documenting civil rights violations. The Hospitality Equality Act, introduced 6 months after the incident, would require businesses serving the public to demonstrate proactive efforts to prevent discrimination rather than simply responding to complaints after damage had been done. Tourism boards and convention centers found themselves competing on inclusion metrics as major corporations began requiring diversity and anti-discrimination policies as prerequisites for hosting large events and conferences. Cities that could demonstrate commitment to inclusive hospitality found themselves attracting more business travel and convention revenue than competitors that hadn't addressed discrimination proactively. International attention had focused on the incident as well, with the European Union citing Grandview's response as a model for how multinational corporations could address workplace discrimination consistently across different cultural and legal contexts. The company's rapid transformation had become a case study in business schools from London to Singapore, demonstrating how authentic leadership could turn crisis into opportunity for meaningful change. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect was cultural rather than institutional, the growing recognition among ordinary citizens that they had power to demand accountability from businesses and organizations that failed to live up to their stated values. Social media had democratized documentation and created channels for immediate response that didn't require years of litigation or regulatory action. Young people in particular had embraced the incident as proof that individual courage combined with technological tools could force institutional change, with #SpeakUp likes of Sophia trending among college students who shared stories of challenging discrimination in their own educational and professional environments. The transformation was ongoing, organic, and powerful enough to suggest that the 27 minutes of confrontation captured in Maya Patel's livestream had catalyzed changes that would outlast any individual career, company policy, or news cycle. Dignity had found its voice, and the echo was still growing stronger. The Platinum Royal Hotel's lobby had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd witnessed the confrontation 6 months earlier, though the physical space remained exactly the same. The marble floors still gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the scent of expensive flowers still perfumed the air, but something essential had shifted in the atmosphere. A warmth and genuine welcome that extended to every guest regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Sophia Martinez walked through the lobby with the confident stride of someone who'd discovered that moral courage was not only rewarded, but essential for authentic leadership. Her role as guest services director having evolved into something approaching guest experience curator. Under her leadership, the Platinum Royal had achieved the highest guest satisfaction scores in Grandview's global portfolio, proving that inclusive practices weren't just ethically right, but financially profitable. The training programs Sophia had piloted had been implemented across all 289 Grandview properties, with employees learning not just what discrimination looked like, but how to create actively welcoming experiences for guests from every background. The results had been immediate and measurable. Guest complaints related to biased treatment had dropped by 94% company-wide, while overall satisfaction scores had reached record highs. Dr. Patricia Williams had used her position on Grandview's board to establish the most comprehensive anti-discrimination legal clinic in the Pacific Northwest with her nonprofit organization, handling over 400 cases in its first 6 months of operation. The clinic provided free representation for workers facing discrimination while also offering training and consultation services for businesses seeking to improve their inclusive practices proactively rather than reactively. The success of the clinic had attracted attention from civil rights organizations around the country, with Dr. Williams receiving inquiries about replicating the model in other major cities. Her combination of legal expertise and corporate board experience had created a unique perspective on how discrimination operated and how it could be prevented through proper oversight and accountability measures. Maya Patel's documentary The Slap That Changed Everything had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and critical acclaim, with distribution deals that would bring the story to audiences around the world. But more importantly, her work had inspired a new generation of activist journalists who understood that social media platforms could be tools for accountability rather than just entertainment. The documentary had also catalyzed broader conversations about power, privilege, and justice in corporate America, with Maya receiving invitations to speak at universities, business conferences, and civil rights organizations about the role of technology in democratizing access to accountability and transparency. Richard Crawford's journey toward redemption had been slower and more complicated, but genuine progress was visible for those willing to look beyond his viral moment of failure. His work as a volunteer trainer in bias recognition programs had given him opportunities to share his experience as a cautionary tale while also demonstrating his commitment to personal growth and institutional change. The therapy and education Crawford had undertaken had revealed the depth of unconscious bias that had guided his professional behavior, but also his capacity for growth when confronted with the consequences of his actions. His marriage had survived through couples therapy that had forced both him and his wife to examine assumptions they'd carried for decades, while his relationship with his daughter had been rebuilt through honest conversations about privilege, prejudice, and personal responsibility. Jessica Torres had completed her certification in diversity and inclusion consulting, while working for a nonprofit organization that helped immigrants navigate workplace discrimination. Her personal experience with participating in bias had become a powerful tool for helping others recognize how prejudice operated and how it could be addressed through education, accountability, and genuine commitment to change. Her work had brought her into contact with other hospitality workers who'd witnessed or participated in discrimination, creating support networks for employees who wanted to challenge bias in their workplaces but needed guidance and encouragement to take those risks. The hospitality industry had undergone comprehensive transformation that extended far beyond Grandview's properties, with major chains competing on inclusion metrics and independent properties seeking certification in diversity and anti-discrimination practices. The industry association had established new standards for bias prevention that were being adopted internationally, creating consistency in expectations for guest treatment regardless of location or local cultural norms. Congressional hearings had resulted in the passage of the Hospitality Equality Act, which required businesses serving the public to demonstrate proactive efforts to prevent discrimination rather than simply responding to complaints after incidents had occurred. The legislation had been supported by both Republican and Democratic lawmakers who recognized that preventing discrimination was both morally necessary and economically beneficial for businesses and communities. Federal agencies had also taken notice, with the Department of Justice establishing new guidelines for investigating discrimination in public accommodations, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission developing resources for workers who wanted to report bias without facing retaliation from employers. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than legal or corporate. The growing recognition among ordinary citizens that they had both the power and the responsibility to challenge discrimination when they encountered it. Social media had created channels for immediate accountability that complemented rather than replaced traditional legal remedies, giving individuals tools for demanding justice that didn't require years of litigation or regulatory action. The transformation was comprehensive, sustainable, and powerful enough to suggest that the incident at the Platinum Royal had catalyzed changes that would outlast any individual career company policy or news cycle. Dignity had not only found its voice, but had created harmonies that were still spreading through corporate America and beyond. 1 year after the confrontation that had transformed her life and career, Daniela Chen stood in the restored gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School in South Seattle, the same building where she'd attended 3rd grade as a foster child, who'd never imagined that success was possible. For someone who looked like her, came from where she'd come from, or carried the particular combination of dreams and determination that had guided her unlikely journey to corporate leadership. The auditorium was filled with current foster children, their faces reflecting the same mixture of hope and wariness that Daniela remembered from her own childhood, when adult promises were suspect, and the future seemed like something that happened to other people rather than something you could actively create through your own choices and efforts. "I want you to understand something important," Daniela told the children, her voice carrying across the renovated space that had been funded by the foundation she'd established in the months following her viral moment of accountability. "Your current circumstances don't determine your future possibilities. Where you are today doesn't limit where you can be tomorrow if you're willing to work for something better." The message resonated not just because of her success, but because of how she'd used her power when it was tested, how she'd chosen to respond to discrimination and injustice with decisive action rather than quiet accommodation. The children had seen the video, understood the significance of the moment when someone who'd started where they were starting had refused to accept treatment that diminished her humanity or theirs. Sofia Martinez had discovered that her promotion from trainee to management had been just the beginning of a career trajectory that was redefining what leadership looked like in the hospitality industry. Her success at the Platinum Royal had led to offers from major hotel chains around the world, but she'd chosen to stay with Grandview to help build the inclusive culture that was transforming not just individual properties, but the entire industry. Her work had expanded beyond operations management to include development of training curricula, consultation with other companies seeking to improve their diversity practices, and mentorship of young employees who were learning that moral courage was not only welcomed but essential for advancement in organizations committed to authentic rather than performative inclusion. The scholarship program Sophia had helped design was sending dozens of young people from immigrant families to hospitality management programs at universities around the country, creating pipelines for diverse leadership that would reshape the industry for generations to come. Dr. Patricia Williams had found in her civil rights work a renewed sense of purpose that had energized her retirement in ways she hadn't expected her legal clinic handling an increasing caseload of discrimination cases, while also providing consultation services for businesses seeking to prevent, rather than just respond to bias incidents. Her granddaughter Emma had been inspired by her grandmother's activism to pursue a law degree with a focus on civil rights, creating a family legacy of fighting for justice that would extend the impact of that single moment of witnessing discrimination and choosing to act rather than remain silent. The legal precedents established through Dr. Williams' clinic had been cited in discrimination cases around the country, creating new standards for corporate accountability and individual liability that were making bias more costly and inclusive practices more valuable for businesses seeking to avoid legal and reputational risks. Richard Crawford's transformation had been the most unexpected and perhaps most significant. His journey from perpetrator to advocate, demonstrating that genuine change was possible, even for those who'd participated in discrimination and faced consequences for their actions. His work with bias education programs had reached thousands of managers and employees across multiple industries. His personal story serving as a powerful example of how unconscious prejudice operated and how it could be addressed through honest self-examination and committed effort to change deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior. Crawford's marriage had not only survived, but had been strengthened by the difficult conversations and therapy sessions that had forced both him and his wife to examine assumptions they'd carried for decades without questioning. His relationship with his daughter had been rebuilt through honest discussions about privilege, responsibility, and the importance of choosing courage over comfort when faced with moral challenges. His teenage daughter, Emma, had become an activist in her own right, using her experience as the child of someone who'd been publicly held accountable for discrimination to educate her peers about bias, privilege, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice. Jessica Torres had leveraged her certification in diversity consulting into a career helping companies address workplace discrimination proactively. Her personal experience with participating in bias giving her unique insights into how prejudice operated and how it could be prevented through proper training, oversight, and accountability measures. Her work had brought her into contact with other employees who'd witnessed or participated in discrimination, creating support networks for workers who wanted to challenge bias in their workplaces, but needed guidance and encouragement to take those risks without jeopardizing their employment security. Maya Patel had used her platform and following to launch a non-profit media organization focused on documenting social justice stories with her team of activist journalists covering discrimination accountability and transformation across multiple industries and geographic regions. The organization's work had already resulted in policy changes at dozens of companies, with executives recognizing that Maya's model of real-time accountability journalism could expose problematic practices before they escalated into public relations disasters that damaged brand value and market position. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening among ordinary citizens who'd witnessed the viral moment of accountability and recognized that they had power to demand better from institutions that claimed to serve the public interest. Social media had democratized access to transparency and created channels for immediate response that complemented traditional legal and regulatory remedies. Young people in particular had embraced the incident as proof that individual courage combined with technological tools could force institutional change with college campuses and workplaces around the country, seeing increased willingness to challenge discrimination when it was encountered rather than ignored or accommodated. The personal transformations were ongoing, organic, and interconnected, creating networks of change that extended far beyond any individual career or corporate policy. Dignity had not only found its voice, but had taught others to use theirs in service of justice and inclusion. The marble lobby of the Platinum Royal Hotel had been transformed once again, this time decorated for a celebration that would have been unimaginable 1 year earlier, when discrimination and violence had shattered the serene facade of luxury hospitality that had hidden deeper problems of bias and exclusion. Representatives from across the hospitality industry had gathered for the first annual Dignity and Service Awards, a recognition program established by Grandview Hospitality to celebrate employees and organizations that had demonstrated exceptional commitment to inclusive practices and authentic welcome for all guests, regardless of background or appearance. Daniela Chen stood at the podium where she'd announced her identity 12 months earlier, her presence now associated not with confrontation and crisis, but with transformation and hope, her story having evolved from viral moment to lasting legacy of corporate accountability and personal courage. 1 year ago, this lobby was the site of a failure. She began her voice carrying across the assembled crowd of industry leaders, civil rights advocates, and hospitality workers who'd come to witness this unprecedented celebration of inclusion and justice. A failure of training, of leadership, of culture, and ultimately of humanity. The audience listened with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing history being made, that this event represented a turning point in how corporate America would address discrimination and bias going forward. But today, this same space represents possibility. Daniela continued. The possibility that crisis can become catalyst, that accountability can lead to transformation, and that individual courage can reshape entire industries when people choose to stand up rather than stay silent. Sophia Martinez had been chosen to present the Employee Courage Award, her journey from complicity to leadership, serving as inspiration for workers across the industry who were learning that speaking truth in difficult moments was not career suicide but career defining for organizations committed to authentic rather than performative values. The hardest thing I've ever done was admit that I'd lied about what I saw on my computer screen. Sophia told the audience, her voice steady and clear as she shared the personal cost and ultimate reward of choosing integrity over security. But that moment of honesty changed everything, not just for me, but for every guest who'll be welcomed in this lobby going forward. Dr. Patricia Williams received the Lifetime Achievement Award for her work establishing legal aid services for discrimination victims and consultation programs for businesses seeking to prevent rather than respond to bias incidents, her clinic having become a model for similar efforts being established in major cities around the country. Justice delayed is justice denied, Dr. Williams said as she accepted the recognition, but justice documented is justice that can be shared, replicated and institutionalized in ways that prevent future victims from suffering. What we've already learned how to address. Maya Patel's documentary had been screened earlier in the evening, its powerful documentation of transformation serving as evidence that social media could be used not just for entertainment, but for accountability journalism that created real-world change through transparent documentation of injustice and institutional response. I thought I was just recording another travel complaint, Maya told the audience, but somehow I ended up documenting proof that individual courage combined with corporate commitment could transform entire industries in real time. Even Richard Crawford had been invited to participate, not to receive recognition, but to share his experience as someone who'd perpetrated discrimination and faced immediate consequences for his actions. His story serving as both cautionary tale and proof that genuine redemption was possible for those willing to examine their own biases honestly. I want every manager in this audience to understand something. Crawford said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lost everything and spent a year rebuilding his understanding of leadership and human dignity. Your unconscious bias will become conscious consequences if you don't address it proactively. The question isn't whether you have prejudices. We all do. The question is what you're doing to recognize and overcome them before they destroy someone else's dignity and your own career. The evening's final speaker was a 15-year-old foster child named Marcus, one of dozens of young people who'd received scholarships through the foundation Daniela had established, his presence representing the future leaders who would inherit the industry that was being transformed by this moment of accountability and growth. Miss Chen showed me that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. Marcus told the assembled industry leaders, his words carrying across the lobby with the confidence of someone who'd learned that dreams were not luxuries, but necessities for people who wanted to create change. But more importantly, she showed me that when you get power, you use it to protect people who don't have any yet. As the evening concluded, guests moved through the lobby that had been transformed not just by decoration, but by culture, by the understanding that authentic hospitality meant creating space for everyone to feel welcomed and valued, regardless of their background or circumstances. The marble floors that had echoed with the sound of discrimination and violence 1 year earlier now resonated with conversations about inclusion justice and the ongoing work of building institutions that honored human dignity as a foundational rather than optional value. Daniela walked through the lobby one final time before leaving her reflection in the polished marble, serving as a reminder that power was most meaningful when it was used in service of principles that elevated everyone, rather than systems that protected only some. The transformation was complete, but not finished ongoing, rather than concluded a living example of how individual moments of courage could catalyze institutional change that outlasted any individual career or corporate policy. The lobby would continue to welcome guests, but it would never again be a place where anyone was made to feel small simply because of who they were or where they'd come from. 3 years after a single slap echoed through the Platinum Royal's marble lobby, the hospitality industry had undergone the most comprehensive transformation in its history. Driven not by government regulation, but by market forces and consumer demand for authentic inclusion that honored the dignity of every traveler, regardless of background or appearance. The Hospitality Equality Act had been signed into law, requiring businesses serving the public to demonstrate proactive efforts to prevent discrimination, rather than simply responding to complaints after damage had been done. The legislation had received bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognized that preventing bias was both morally necessary and economically beneficial for businesses and communities seeking to attract diverse customers and talented employees. Daniela Chen's model of immediate accountability had been adopted by companies across multiple industries, with executives recognizing that swift response to discrimination incidents could prevent minor problems from escalating into public relations disasters that destroyed brand value and market position. Business schools taught her crisis response as a case study in authentic leadership that prioritized values over damage control. Sophia Martinez now operated a chain of 5 boutique hotels that had become industry leaders in inclusive practices, her properties serving as training centers where hospitality workers from around the world learned how dignity and profitability were not competing interests, but complementary values that strengthened each other through authentic implementation rather than performative gestures. Dr. Patricia Williams' legal clinic had expanded into a national network providing free representation for discrimination victims while also offering consultation services for businesses seeking to prevent bias incidents before they occurred. Her work had resulted in landmark legal precedents that made discrimination more costly and inclusion more valuable for organizations serving the public. Even Richard Crawford had found redemption through his work as a bias education specialist. His personal experience with perpetrating discrimination and facing immediate consequences providing powerful testimony for the thousands of managers and executives who'd participated in his training programs across multiple industries and geographic regions. The viral moment that had destroyed his first career had become the foundation for a second one, dedicated to preventing others from making the same mistakes. He'd made his story serving as proof that genuine transformation was possible, even for those who'd participated in exclusion and faced public accountability for their actions. The international impact had been equally significant, with the European Union citing Grandview's response as a model for how multinational corporations could address workplace discrimination consistently across different cultural and legal contexts, while businesses from London to Singapore implemented similar policies, recognizing that inclusion was not just an American concern but a global business necessity. The slap that was meant to silence had amplified voices that couldn't be ignored, creating ripple effects that continued expanding 3 years later as new generations of workers and consumers demanded accountability from institutions that claimed to serve everyone but had historically excluded many. In hotel lobbies across America and beyond, guests of every background now walked through doors opened by one woman's refusal to be made small, her moment of standing ground having transformed not just individual careers, but entire industries committed to ensuring that dignity was not an upgrade, but a right that belonged to everyone. If this powerful story of justice and transformation moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world more fair and just. Share this video with your family and friends because these stories of standing up for what's right need to reach as many people as possible. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you witnessed injustice or stood up for someone else. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire others to choose courage over comfort when it matters most.